Here is a question for you. Among the 5 elders, who is the one whose transformation is different from the rest? This is a pretty stupid question, because the answer is spoiled by the thumbnail, but it is Saint Shepherd Shueisha. This is because while all the other elders transform into ancient demons from Eastern mythology, Shueisha transforms into a sandworm, a creature from the 20th century science fiction series, Dune. Peter's transformation, however, has the potential to fundamentally change the One Piece story in the final saga. The notable thing about Shueisha is that he pretty clearly is the American member of the Gorosei. All of the elders are based on famous historical leaders, but the one Peter resembles is the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. With this context, it makes sense that the story also gave Peter a power from one of America's famous works of fiction. But him transforming into a sandworm also breaks one of the oldest rules of the One Piece story. When One Piece characters have in the past transformed into supernatural creatures, these are creatures that have always been from ancient real-world religions or mythologies. This even goes for Sangat Nika, who despite being a special deity of the One Piece world, actually bears heavy resemblance to mythical figures from places like real-world Africa and the Caribbean. But Shueisha is different. Dune is not some ancient story from folklore. Instead, it is a science fiction novel that was published within the last 100 years. From the research I did on this video, Dune is also inarguably the basis for Peter's powers. The word sandworm existed before Dune, as did other fictional gigantic worms, but Frank Herbert's Dune was the first story to combine these two ideas. The fact that there is now a character in One Piece with the power to transform into a creature from a recent work of fiction changes the game, as it opens the door for other characters in the manga also having powers based on contemporary stories. In other words, One Piece may no longer be a story that only features things like ancient Chinese dragons or Japanese yokai running around, but in the final saga, it is now possible that we will see characters who will transform into anything from Godzilla to Winnie the Pooh. I think a good character I could use to illustrate just how game-changing this could be would be Saint Figarland Garling, who is one of the story's endgame players, whose full powers have not yet been revealed. Now that he's a member of the 5 Elders, Garling may very well get his own special transformation, just like the other Gorosei. But instead of Garling transforming into a mythical creature from ancient folklore, what if just like Shueisha, he actually turned into a creature from a very recent work of fiction? There is actually a good argument that this is what Garling's power is actually going to end up being. One of the commenters on my channel brought up a really interesting observation, which is that the creatures all the elders transformed into may all correspond with how old the elders themselves are. Considering both his looks and the way he carries himself, Shueisha may well be the youngest of the original elders, which corresponds with him transforming into a fictional creature that was also invented hundreds of years after the others. However, despite his looks, Garling could very well be even younger than Peter, which, if this idea is correct, might mean that he will transform into an even more recent fictional creature than Dune's sandworm. So, what could this creature actually be? I think Garling is a really good character to use as an example for the topic of this video, but I have one really interesting idea for what his powers could be. For whatever reason, the God's Knights wear these black cloaks. This is clearly for more than just camouflage, as Garling himself is seen wearing his cloak in broad daylight in the Holy Land during Nilfgaard's execution. What if these cloaks, however, were foreshadowing for Garling's future transformation? There are a lot of demonic creatures in fiction that also wear black cloaks, but I have one particular monster in mind that I think would really fit Garling and the One Piece story. What if the manga did something completely mad and actually gave Garling the ability to turn into a Dementor? Now, I don't personally have the best understanding of how copyright law would work in this case, but what I do know is that other works of fiction have already gotten away with stealing from Harry Potter. This, for example, happened in Stephen King's Dark Tower series, which actually made elements from Harry Potter a central feature of the story in the last few books. In these books, I kid you not, there's actually characters throwing around Harry Potter snitches like they're hand grenades, but somehow King got away with doing this. But actually, there is already a precedent of the One Piece story borrowing material from Harry Potter, and this happened last year. The cover page of One Piece chapter 1128 is the Straw Hats dressed up like wizards from Potter. So Oda is pretty clearly a fan. This is not too surprising, since Harry Potter is insanely massive in Japan, as it is one of the only 3 countries in the world with a Harry Potter theme park. But you can also find several Potter-themed cafes and restaurants all across the country. It's kind of easy to forget how global and huge Harry Potter is, but this just makes me even more confused how Stephen King got away with ripping Rowling off. So please, if there's anyone knowledgeable about the topic watching this video, educate me in the comments. Even if you're not though, you should use this brief interlude to subscribe, since I hopefully managed to continue my daily upload streak with this video and have plenty more One Piece content on the way. If One Piece already managed to rip out a monster straight from the Dune books, and if the manga already managed to make a cover page based on the franchise, I think it's very feasible that we could see actual creatures from Harry Potter in the canon One Piece story. This could honestly also be a pretty good fit for Saint Garling's powers. If Jupiter is essentially the American Gorosei, who's been given a power from an American story, giving Garling powers from a British work of fiction might only be following this trend, since there's already more than a couple connections between the Figarland family and the British Isles. The presence of souls in the One Piece story has also become more and more important the longer the manga has gone on, so Garling turning into a Dementor, a monster that can actually suck out a person's soul, could be pretty frightening. But I also feel like it would fit with how cold and heartless of a person Garling has already been presented as. But sincerely, it could also be something else, and this is just an example to show the bigger idea of this video. Since Jupiter has now broken the dam, One Piece characters using powers that are based on other recent works of fiction could very well go far beyond just the Gorosei. The final saga is still filled with characters whose abilities have not yet been revealed. And if this video's idea is right, Luffy and the Straw Hats could end up facing anything from Nazgul and Balrogs to Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck during the final war. If you think this would be too crazy for One Piece, it really is not, but it is instead something the story has arguably been building towards for years. While Jupiter is the first character to turn into a creature from a recent work of fiction, One Piece has actually been borrowing elements from contemporary stories for literal decades. This goes all the way back to the pre-time skip, where we already have scenes that indicate that the One Piece story possibly has its own version of something like the Emerald City from The Wizard of Oz. That Harry Potter cover page I mentioned earlier is also just the tip of the iceberg, where One Piece's cover pages include basically everything, from Dracula to Mario, to even Legos. The last of which has now been included in the canon story in the final saga. One Piece taking huge influence from recent works of fiction was also a huge part of the story's biggest moment with Gear 5. The main aesthetic the manga has used for Luffy's awakening has actually been early Western cartoon animation, such as Tom and Jerry. So, let's say that this video is actually right, where now that we're in the final saga, Jupiter was only the first, where several other characters will also be revealed to have powers from recent works of fiction. While I already went over Garling, who could these other characters be? Just to stick with the Figarland family, I also feel like Shamrock may be a pretty good bet. He's essentially the story's dark version of Shanks, which could also mean that exactly unlike Shanks, Shamrock is someone who leans heavily on using devil fruit powers. This is arguably already the case, with Shamrock's sword having the Cerberus fruit, making him one of the handful of characters in the whole story to fight with a devil fruit item. I actually have one really stupid idea for what Shamrock's personal devil fruit could be, but I am almost too embarrassed to say it. As he's the captain of the God's Knights, what if Shamrock's devil fruit was the human fruit, Jedi Knight? Just like One Piece and Harry Potter, One Piece and Star Wars have already made more than a few crossovers in the past. The stories also already have more than a couple similarities between them, such as clones, super weapons, or even lightsabers. In my own experience, Star Wars, like Potter, is also pretty massive in Japan and is constantly referenced by a lot of the country's biggest franchises. While this is still just my random idea, there could be a lot of potential at Shamrock having the powers of a Jedi. Shamrock is not just a knight who also fights with a sword, but his huge point as a character is that he's in a very real sense Shanks with 2 arms. I think one of the best ways the story could use this would be by giving Shamrock the ability to dual wield, with him possibly being able to produce another sword to use in combination with Cerberus. What we also know about Shamrock is that just like his dad, Shamrock is actually incredibly sadistic. The God's Knight's entire game of kidnapping Elbaf's children is actually an idea that came from Shamrock. He was even gleeful at them doing this, even though Shamrock himself was just about to leave and could not even participate in this game. If Shamrock is someone who enjoys seeing others suffer, there's a lot of ways his character could utilize something like the Force, where at least in Star Wars, this ability was several times used for literal torture. I am only using Garling and Shamrock, as well as their potential powers, as examples. I am by no means trying to predict their powers. I'm just spitballing ideas of the potential One Piece may have just unlocked by introducing Joe Peters' powers, and how this could change the manga's entire landscape during the final saga. There's also still plenty of other mysterious characters in the story we've never seen fight. Even though this is the endgame, we also keep being introduced to new hidden powerful characters in every arc. So as usual with One Piece, the possibilities just keep on piling up. There is just that one pesky quote from Kizaru in Marineford, where he said that mythical Zoans are the most rare type of devil fruits. But if you ask me, we're already past the point of that being true. I don't really hold this against Kizaru though. We all make mistakes. But what definitely wasn't a mistake was Kizaru apparently, quote, losing to Luffy on Egghead. If you're interested to find out why, definitely click here to watch this video, where I point by point go over just how much Kizaru was acting during this arc, where the entire fight with Luffy was essentially just a big performance, and that after all these years, we've still never seen Borsalino show his full power. Thank you to all my members for the loot. I really appreciate everyone who watched this video to the end.